My name is Mrs. McDonough, and I am Christopher's mother. He is in 5th grade in Stanford, and I'm going to read The Little Ships by Louise Borden, and it was illustrated by Michael Foreman. And I want to tell you a little bit about this book before I get started. It takes place during World War II, and I took a trip with my mother to England, and she bought this book to remember that trip, and we went to the place where this story took place, right off of Dover in England, in the south part of England. And so she bought this to remember that beautiful place that we went to. And so here's some pictures. Beautiful artwork in the story. Okay, so I'm going to read about this page first. Okay, here we go. In 1940, I lived with my father in the town of Deal on the Kent coast of England, safe from the thunder of the Germans' guns in France. Some days in May I could hear it, rolling in big booms across the English Channel. Some days I could feel it, rattling the glass in the windows on our street. My father, Martin Gates, owned the Lucy, a sturdy fishing smack. Her wooden tubs were thick and heavy and smelled of herring and mackerel and cod. I liked to watch my father's quick hands stacking tubs and sorting fish. I liked to listen to Dad's friends, trading stories on the beach. They were all Deal fishermen too. But now their talk was about the trouble in Dunkirk. Just across the channel, only 50 miles away, British soldiers were trapped there, they said. Thousands and thousands. And so were the French. The Germans and their tanks would capture them. Families would lose all those men who were uncles and brothers and fathers and sons. Every boat on the English coast was needed to go and help. The owners were to report for orders and for maps and charts. My brother John was a British soldier fighting in France. Maybe he was in this trouble too. Maybe he was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk and was waiting for a Navy ship or a fishing boat like the Lucy to bring him home. Fishermen on the beach said I was my father's daughter. I could set an anchor and coil a rope and nudge speed into the Lucy's old engine better than some of the villagemen who were signing up to go to Dunkirk, like Mr. Lewis, who worked at the post office, Mr. Cribben, the locksmith, and Mr. Marsh, who had taught geometry to John. So I pulled on a wool cap of my father's that smelled of herring, and a patched pair of John's outgrown trousers. Only my father knew it was me. Hurry, not much time. Too many men, not enough ships. Those were the words we heard echoing in town and up and down the beach. I hurried to help Dad stack cans of water. I lugged more cans full of fuel and yards of rope, and I hurried again to haul the wet nets off the Lucy. We'll need every inch of room for soldiers, my father called to me over his shoulder. Maybe even John, I called back. That afternoon we sailed for Dunkirk. Dad didn't have much time for talk. He kept his words in his hands, stowing a rope ladder and checking the engine gears. And he kept his words in his eyes, reading the channel charts and maps, scanning the sky thick with clouds. My father wasn't famous, but he knew about the sea and the tides and currents and how to steer clear of the Goodwin Sands. He was the one who had taught me to read a compass, and he could name all the stars at night like the explorers I had studied in school. Here's some of the beautiful pictures. Look at all those ships sailing on the water. So on the last day of May, the Lucy left Deal and sailed north to Ramsgate to join the motley group of ships. All kinds were in her convoy. Farther out in the channel past the Goodwins, our group joined with others. It was like an amazing armada. Armada. It was a word from my school book. And there I was in the middle of the biggest armada of all. That day, the line of convoys going to help rescue the British Army was almost 5 miles long, stretched end to end on a smooth gray sea. To save time and fuel, tugboats and bigger ships pulled little ships in their wakes. A lot of tow ropes frayed and snapped. A lot of rusty motors sputtered and stopped. I listened to the low throb of the Lucy's engine. Hour after hour, mile after mile, steady engine, steady friend. The dozens of ships around us were headed to Dunkirk too. The littlest ships looked even smaller under that sullen channel sky. Everyone in the boats around the Lucy knew there was trouble up ahead. Big Navy ships passed with their white wakes, going the other way, headed back from Dunkirk to England and to home. They made a silent parade, not grand, just uniform brown and battleship gray. Their decks and railways were crowded with men. I tried to look up and find John in that sea of tin helmets and tired faces, but they were the faces of strangers, and not my tall, skinny brother. Dad handed me a mug of strong, sweet tea and a woolly, thick jacket to keep off the channel chill. When our convoy reached the French coast, we heard the German guns. Other guns were answering back. And then the Lucy was there, off Dunkirk's beaches, in the night and in the early morning, and it was real. All the oily smoke that got in my eyes and all the terrible noise that got in my ears, and all the men. The sandy beaches at Dunkirk were black with lines that curved like snakes, and the lines were British soldiers. And the French were there too. There were even men standing shoulder to shoulder along the length of the Mole, the narrow wooden pier in Dunkirk's harbor. Thousands of soldiers waiting for ships. We stayed close to a minesweeper, then sailed into the shallows to ferry our first load. I called back the depth of the water as Dad steered the Lucy toward the beach. Not a beach like Deal's. This beach was wide and flat, its sand covered by men who were hungry and thirsty, by horses running loose from their French riders, by dozens of barking dogs, by trucks and equipment, by the wild mess of an army on the run. See those pages. And there were hundreds of other ships that were little like ours, English and French, Belgian and Dutch. We were all there rowing and carrying and paddling and ferrying from the sand beaches to the big ships anchored out in deeper water and back again. My father gazed at the thousands of men, and I knew that what he was thinking, and that he was thinking about John. He stood at the helm, holding the Lucy steady in the water against the wakes from other ships, against broken planks washing toward the beach, against lost boots and army coats, and everything that soldiers leave behind when they can take only themselves. I had to stand taller and help my father. I had to help soldiers whose names I never knew, and not say that I was afraid to see war. I had to pretend that my arms didn't ache from hauling soldiers dripping wet onto the rocky deck of our boat. My hands were rubbed raw inside the work gloves that fit my father, not me. Most of Dunkirk was burning, town and harbor, houses and docks. I had to rub the sting from my eyes, not from tears, but from the black smoke. And I couldn't look for more than a second at a soldier who cried for me to give him water, who had no bandages, just blood all down his front. We ferried a Cameron Highlander who couldn't find his regiment, and a red-faced cook who spoke only French, and so many British soldiers that I lost count of how many in all the Lucy's loads out to the big ships. I saw two men side by side in a half-swamped rowboat, pulling on oars for hours, ferrying a beaten army, a few men at a time. I saw a plank raft with a rusty old bicycle strapped down with bits of rope, and a soldier who'd lost his helmet, who brought a parakeet in a cage. I saw men who were brave and some who were not. I heard shouts in English and in French and in Belgium and in Dutch. Get the men off the beaches! Get the men off the mole! Get them onto the ships! Get them back home! That was the job we had been sent to do. That was the job, and we each had a part. I kept checking the Lucy's fuel. When only 2 cans were still full, we followed a Smoky Joe and a Dutch scoot. It says that a Smoky Joe was a nickname used in the British Navy for a minesweeper, and a scoot is a flat-bottomed Dutch boat, originally known as a scoot. So, when only 2 cans were still full, we followed a Smoky Joe and a Dutch scoot and turned to head home. My father and I prayed that John, if you were here, had found a place on a sturdy ship. Suddenly the sky was filled with the noise of an enemy plane. It was a dive-bombing German Stuka. Some stray bullets hit the Lucy, and she sprang a dozen leaks. Our last load of soldiers had to bail with their helmets on the miles going home, but the Lucy's engine kept running steady with that throb I knew so well. And then we were there, with dozens of other ships streaming into the safety of the harbor at Dover, bringing our army home. I helped my father look for John among all the ships unloading men. I asked busy officers who were yelling orders, but no one could tell me news. The ships crowding the harbor were full of tall, skinny soldiers, but none were John Gates from Deal. Mr. Lewis and Mr. Marsh spotted the Lucy and came to tell us how they'd been towed by a British trawler all the way back to the White Cliffs of Dover. And then they looked away and said Mr. Cribben wouldn't ever be coming home. And so we went back to Deal and sailed the Lucy onto the narrow beach. We kept the black matted dog that a French sergeant had asked us to take. I named him Smoky Joe. Smoky, with his damp rope collar, was a part of Dunkirk that we brought home to Deal. There's Smoky. On June 3rd, we got word that John had come back safely on a Belgian tug, and the very next day I sat by the radio with my father and Smoky Joe. I sat straight up when the Prime Minister thundered his grand speech. I was glad that Mr. Churchill didn't keep his words in his hands and in his eyes in the way of Deal fishermen. At first, he had thought only a few men could be saved from the beaches of Dunkirk. He was wrong. The newspaper later said over 338,000 men came home. But I think Mr. Churchill knew all along that our country could do it if everyone pulled together. That's why he sent all those big Navy ships and the little ships like our Lucy, too. That's the end of the story. So, here's a little picture. You can see it. A little drawing of Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England. He's kind of like the President of the United States, but over in England. And he was the one that ordered these ships to go and try to save our men during World War II. And they saved Englishmen, and they saved Frenchmen, and they saved a few Americans who had volunteered over there. But they brought them all back over to Dover, and there was a hospital undergrounds in the cliffs of Dover, and they were able to go down into the hospital and have surgeries and different things and save these men's lives who had tried to sacrifice for their country. There's a picture from the book, the back of the book. And here's the front again. So if you enjoyed reading that book, I would think that you might want to go to Dover someday and see that place for yourself, because it's pretty special. And my mom and I had a really good time over in Dover. And Dover is one of my favorite places in the whole world. Okay. Thank you for listening to my story.